Ahearn. We have a special guest today.
Yes, we're excited to be joined by Rachel Meyer. Welcome.
Hey,
Hi,
Rachel.
everyone. Thanks for having me.
I know you've been up on Capitol Hill a lot lately. Can you just give us a sense of some of the things you've been working on?
Yeah, so we're coming up at the end of the year, which means starting to try to do what we can to get ASN's policy priorities that the organization set out in January across the finish line to the greatest degree possible. The good news is that we have made great strides in a number of priority areas. We can talk about that both from an authorizing as well as an appropriations or a funding angle. And the other piece of good news is that although this Congress has set a record for fewest number of bills passed, there's a whole nother year of the 119th Congress ahead. So we've got 365 days plus 11 at the time of this recording to get the priority legislation that we've had introduced on and onto the president's desk.
Yeah, it's interesting because the contrast between the most executive orders from a president in a year versus the fewest bills across the finish line or bills passed by a Congress in a year is really telling about how government is changing.
At the same time that we're seeing less of a smooth, routine, and efficient congressional process. And there are obviously a number of challenges on the administration and the executive branch front. I think kidney remains a bipartisan bright spot of interest from both parties and up and down Pennsylvania Avenue. Um, I think we have more reason in the nephrology community, perhaps than other specialties, even to be optimistic about what we can accomplish in the waning days of 2025 and certainly in the year ahead in 2026.
Yeah, so maybe using that as a starting point for a discussion about appropriation. So, can you just give us a sense of what has been included, particularly within the Department of Health and Human Services funding bill, that are things that we've been advocating for?
I'd be happy to. So, just to remind our listeners, every spring, ASN brings our Policy and Advocacy Committee, which focuses on legislative issues, and our Transplant Policy Committee, newly formed in 2025, to Capitol Hill to meet with their congressional delegations, Appropriations Committee staff members, to articulate what we really want to see the government both fund in terms of dollars and prioritize in terms of how those dollars get spent within the agencies once they're allocated. And it may sound like the March to now December timeline, or perhaps January, as we'll talk about, is a really long time for some delayed gratification. Happy to report that that is actually very fast in Washington's version of the Gregorian calendar. So when those committees came to Capitol Hill with us this March, there were a few things that we really focused on asking legislators to prioritize in both the House and the Senate's appropriations bills that fund the Department of Health and Human Services. Of course, advocating for kidney research, particularly NIDDK, is always going to be a top focus of ASN. We have also done a lot of work trying to help galvanize Congress to invest more in the kidney and overall transplant system than we have in past years, even decades, to focus on modernizing that system and enabling its technology in particular to come into the 21st century. If you think about a lot of the challenges that our transplant system is facing, allocation out of sequence, a growing discard rate, some challenges in terms of public trust, a lot of the solutions to those challenges actually lie in technology adoption and improved processes. So that was a second area of focus for us during the spring appropriations season. And certainly last but not least is Kidney X. How can Congress and the federal government help partner with ASN to shine a light on unmet need for kidney patients and catalyze investments in innovation? Fast forward to July and September when the Appropriations Committees released their draft bills. All of those things that I just mentioned were featured either in terms of dollar amount plus ups and or what we call report language. This is a description from Congress on how they'd like to see the money they're giving out spent. And many of the things that our members advocated for were specifically, even in some cases, verbatim included in how both the House and the Senate envisioned directing the agencies to spend their money. It was a tough year in terms of actual dollar amounts. Some of the programs we care most about saw only modest increases, or in some cases, flat funding. I'm here to tell you that is a huge win in 2025. Many other programs across the federal government, and particularly in HHS, fell victim to a roughly 40% budget cut that had been proposed by the White House. I think this reflects the entire kidney community and the transplant community's strong and united advocacy to help Congress understand the importance of investing in those programs that I just named.
Yeah, so maybe that's the place to start with. First, just to summarize the three overall goals, research funding, particularly for the NIDDK within the National Institutes of Health. The second, a number of different transplant-related policies and activities, which are across HHS, which I think is a level of complication here that other sort of asks, don't have because they tend to be a little bit more focused. And then the third is Kidney X, the partnership between ASN and the Department of Health and Human Services. So two of these are kind of research innovation. One is transplant. Um, why don't we start with the transplant piece? Because it seems like the good news is this is something that the first Trump administration prioritized and was enthusiastic through the executive order of having transplant policy change and for it to address many of the concerns from the community. Those efforts continued in the Biden administration, and then the second Trump administration has picked them up, and it sounds like simultaneously Congress is supporting that. So can you just provide us some specific details of some of the things that were included in the appropriations legislation?
So picking up on transplant themes that carried over from the first Trump administration, and you're 100% right about their emphasis on that. I'll give you three good examples. This isn't the entirety of what was included in these House and Senate proposed spending bills, but one of the things that the first Trump administration did really effectively is increase the focus on better supporting living donors. And this year's bills included increases in funding for the program at HHS that reimburses living donors who are incurring expenses, time off work, et cetera. And there was some nice dedicated language acknowledging that many Americans would be unable to donate a kidney were it not for this program. ASN, the National Kidney Foundation, many other groups advocated for increases. So I think that's a great example of a bipartisan carry through from the first Trump administration. Another theme that we saw in the executive order that was also reflected in this year's spending bill in terms of transplant is how do we increase access for every American who might benefit from a kidney transplant? Yes, there's a shortage of organs, but I think we're also taking steps to mitigate, as I mentioned earlier, our discard rate. So to me, a very interesting directive from the Senate was to ask HRSA to issue a report on whether the metrics that transplant centers are held to might kind of inadvertently disincentivize access for certain patients, maybe those who are more complex, for example. And if that's the case, what can we do to strike a balance between patient safety and ensuring the highest quality of care with also ensuring access for every American who could benefit from what is for many the optimal therapy for kidney failure? In that same vein, we saw some very nice language directed at NIDDK, calling for additional research into disparities in access to kidney transplantation. So you can kind of see how, across HHS, appropriators are thinking about the different levers that they have to reinforce our transplant infrastructure and increase access.
Since you mentioned NIDDK, maybe to use that as an opportunity to shift gears to funding for NIH in general and NIDDK in particular. And I think I'm struggling in my head because on the one hand, there have been all these challenges faced by the research infrastructure, particularly NIH, multi-year funding, cuts to indirect costs, issues around cuts to intramural funding, some of the concerns about oversight and sort of direction in terms of what's funded and what's not. Given that environment, help us understand why you seem so optimistic about funding for NIDDK in particular.
Let's not make any bones about it. We did not see the level of increase in funding for NIH overall that the entire medical community called for, or for NIDDK in particular. At the same time, in both the House and Senate's bills, we didn't see massive cuts to NIDDK's budget. And in contrast, we saw some very thoughtful language emphasizing that NIDDK ought to focus on chronic kidney disease research. I already mentioned the disparities angle. Um, some of the language that was included, in fact, reflected a letter that ASN, together with the National Kidney Foundation, led that more than 40 organizations in the kidney and transplant community signed, calling for that exact type of focus at NIDDK on kidney. So I think I have, on the one hand, a sense of disappointment that's shared across all of medicine and the research community that there isn't more of an appetite or a latitude to really plus up the NIH in the way that we all feel the Institute needs. At the same time, kidney has not been forgotten and continues to be something that those making funding decisions in Congress want to see NIH and NIDDK in particular making strides on. I believe the only other disease state that got a call out was type 1 diabetes. And if you think about the NIDDK's vast portfolio, that's not an insignificant accomplishment.
Yeah, and there's also, the separate funding stream, and there's a whole long-standing relationship. So to be included sort of there, I think is an important statement from Congress, and one that we should not underemphasize. I mean, I do think it's an important point that you're making. So just help us out in terms of process. So where are we now in the process? What's likely to happen moving forward?
So, as I referenced, the House Appropriations Committee that focuses on healthcare issues and the Senate Appropriations Committee that focus on healthcare issues have each kind of developed their own bill. Um, Again, we fared very well as a kidney and transplant community, I think, in each, considering the circumstances. What needs to happen moving forward is that the chairs of the appropriations committees in each the House and Senate have to decide exactly how much money they're going to give at what we call a top line to this Department of Health and Human Services and other things legislation. From there, the two sort of on a bicameral basis, there will be negotiations about exactly which funding levels, if there are discrepancies, are selected and which report language, if there are discrepancies, gets included in a final sort of conference version of these bills. Congress is not likely to take up those efforts until January. While it does appear as of Thursday, December 18th, that the Senate may pass its version in a package of other spending bills, the two chambers of Congress will not come together until January. The clock is going to be ticking because government funding runs out January 30th. So there's going to be, 20 some, even fewer legislating days to actually make this come together. From my recent conversations on the Hill, my sense is that nobody wants to see another government shutdown. Both of these House and Senate appropriations committees have worked really hard over virtually the last 12 months to have these spending packages that they're proud of come together. They want to see that be enacted so that their spending priorities can happen. While the kidney and transplant community did well in terms of coherence across the House and Senate bill, both generally in terms of funding levels and in terms of priorities, a lot remains to be seen about what the overall climate in Washington will look like come January. We obviously are in the midst of some very contentious votes and processes around whether or not the ACA subsidies will be extended. Um, no one's real happy on either side of the aisle about where things are, even within parties. There's some disagreement. We're seeing a growing frustration in the House, particularly with the splintering of certain Republicans away from the party to talk about a vote on ACA subsidies that indicates perhaps Speaker Johnson may not have the kind of grip on the majority that would make for a relatively more functional process come January. So that is another question mark. Obviously not something ASN has influence over, but something we're watching nonetheless. And then, the degree to which appropriators can agree on a top line number to negotiate backwards from. So there are a lot of questions that are out of our and other stakeholders in the community's control. But I hope that the take home message is that ASN's efforts and the efforts of other partner organizations within our community have really paid dividends in a lemon difficult funding climate.
And just to circle back to where you started in terms of the process and the number of steps involved in the process, I think that's a really key point in the sense that this is something we have to do every year. And the more unified we are as a community, and the clearer we are as to what we want, I think the better we do. And so maybe just to before we shift to Lauren, because I know she has a couple of questions for you. I'm just sort of curious. I know we've talked before about the Transforming Kidney Health Research report. My sense is that a lot of the success in transplant has been a result of this sort of coherent working together with the community, NKF, other members of the kidney community, all sort of in agreement in terms of what we want. Help us understand how a report like the Transforming Kidney Health Research can be helpful for future years. I know it's guided a little bit this year, but as we think to the future.
So, in my experience, the way to position yourself for the greatest likelihood of success when you're interacting with Congress, whether it's asking for appropriations and funding or specific changes through authorizing legislation, is to have a really clear articulation of the problem you're trying to solve and the specific levers that are likely to alleviate that problem and why. When you think about the breadth and depth of kidney research, it's hard to come up with a tight, cogent answer. And that's why the collaborative work that went into TKHR is so valuable. The work that ASN, AKF, AAKP, and NKF all put into articulating the scope of the problem of kidney diseases in America and the areas with the greatest likelihood to make a difference in people's lives if we invest in research is now done. That doesn't have to be replicated for a year, 2 years, maybe even 5 years. That creates a great opportunity for the rest of the kidney community to rally behind it because it was a very broad and inclusive report, rare kidney diseases all the way through xenotransplantation and early detection. There's something for everyone in here, which I think lowers the bar to entry for even some of the smaller groups out there that may not normally have a clear path into advocating for kidney research. That is now available to anyone who wants to pick up on the report in its entirety or even subsets and facets of it. I think from the ASN perspective, we see this as our number one legislative priority in the year ahead, and we're excited to work with anyone in the community who wants to join with us in calling for enactment of these funding priorities.
Yeah, I think as we shift to Lauren and her questions, just to pick up your last point about priorities for next year and thinking about next year. I mean, clearly the two that you've mentioned, research funding and transplant policy, are at the top of the list, and then the third would be something around the nephrology workforce, immigration issues, et cetera. And I'm not sure exactly what those policy levers are at this time, but clearly there's a lot that needs to happen in that arena. And I think that's probably the other piece where a group like ASN is sort of uniquely positioned to, in the legislative arena, have some influence. Obviously, Lauren has a much longer list in the regulatory arena of all the different things she's been working on, and things like the Medicare ESRD program proposed rules and the QIP and all of that is going to happen no matter what we do. So we have to be ready for that. That's kind of the eternal challenge in terms of being responsive. But Lauren, do you have questions for Rachel?
Sure. I'm actually gonna shift gears to what we can expect in the coming days. As we discussed in our last podcast, parts of the government, like the FDA, the agriculture, and part of the Department of Defense is funded with the agreement that they reached to open the government last time. Rachel, given that you've been on Capitol Hill and having conversations with some staffers, what do you think the odds are that the government will shut down in the coming days?
Lauren, it either will or it won't.
Yeah,
I mean,
50-50.
I think, as I said, I think the appropriations committees, their chairs, they want to see their hard work get across the finish line. Um, no one wants another government shutdown. A lot of their ability to work on a bipartisan basis, I think, is going to be informed by some of the non-funding conversations that are happening in the waning days of 2025. Think we're just going to have to take 2026 as it comes. There are a lot of questions that we as ASN certainly don't have the answers to and aren't going to realistically influence. The key takeaway is we've done our job.
That's probably a good place to stop. So we have done our job. We're doing everything possible. I think if anyone listening to the podcast has suggestions, either for specific legislative and regulatory asks that you're curious about, or any sort of feedback in terms of are there other areas or other issues that we should be concerned about, please let us know. But otherwise, I want to wish you both happy holidays and a wonderful holiday season, and we will reconvene in 2026 as we go from the year of the snake to the year of the horse.
Thank you.
Thanks, Todd.
This podcast is copyrighted by the American Society of Nephrology. All rights reserved. All content in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to be medical advice. This podcast should not be used in a medical emergency or for the diagnosis or treatment of any medical condition. Please consult your doctor or other qualified healthcare professional if you have any questions about any medical condition or before taking any drug, changing your diet, or commencing or discontinuing any course of treatment. Thank you for listening to this podcast from the American Society of Nephrology.